Welcome back, folks. I am here today to talk about herbs that support the mood and uplift the mood, as well as general natural mood support. And as I record this, it's January 2025. And this particular class is live streaming in partnership with the Concord Food Co-op, but I will also be utilizing the recording for some of my series students and posting it on my Maria Noel Groves YouTube channel. So you can check it out. And it is being recorded, so folks who have registered will get the slides link as well as the video link at some point in the not too distant future after class. So just a little bit of housekeeping there. And I am Maria Noel Groves. I'm a clinical herbalist. I am based formerly in Allenstown, but now in Chichester, New Hampshire. And my business is threefold. And I'll move over to my little bio thing there. Let's see, there we go. So my business is threefold. Basically, it's teaching. I teach a lot of classes. I have a lot of series coming up this spring through autumn. So if you like this class, you can check those out. And I also do a lot of one-off and community classes like this one. So teaching, writing, I've written quite a few books. I'm in the process of writing a few more. So it's all really exciting. And I've written for a lot of magazines over the years. Originally, my degree was in journalism, and then I dove into herbalism. So all my writing has been about plants. And then I do see clients as well, admittedly, because I am writing books right now. I don't have a whole lot of availability in my schedule, but I do consultations when I am able to fit it into my schedule. And I have been working with herbs for more than 2 decades now, which has just been a real blessing to be able to do that. So these are the 3 books that I have out currently: Body into Balance, which is now available internationally and in multiple languages; Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies, and Herbal Remedies for Sleep is the book that came out most recently, a little less than a year ago. And I do have 2 new books coming out. Next January, I'll have another body system specific herb book. And then the January after that will be yet another that I'm going to be writing this spring. So I can't share those topics yet, but they are to come. And I have lots and lots of information on my website. And I also send about monthly emails through my newsletter. So you can check that out. It's wintergreenbotanicals.com. You could also click this link on your slides. Pretty much all these underlined things are hot linked. So once you have the PDF of the slides after class, you can click those links to get, web pages and resources and all those kinds of things. So you can feel free to check those out if you're interested. I post tons of free information online. We are going to be migrating the computer technology on the back end in about another week or so. So if you encounter any glitches right around then, that's why. So today's talk, we are going to be covering some basics on mood support and mood conditions, particularly focusing on depression and seasonal affective disorder, as well as just kind of like blues, down mood kind of stuff. We are going to cover some really important safety tips, not just to cover my butt, but because they are actually really, really important safety tips. And we'll talk a little bit about natural approaches in general, especially diet and lifestyle. And the main bulk of our class is going to be discussing the herbs. I was listening to an older version of this that I taught in 2019, and I liked it. We covered a lot of good stuff, but it took me a long time to get to the herbs, which is why I think you're all here. So I tried to rearrange things a little bit, and I even added a few new herbs and supplements. And so I hope you enjoy the way this particular class is laid out. And if you yourself are dealing with a low mood, or somebody else who is, you are not alone, and they are not alone. It's really quite common. Studies suggest that approximately 21% of Americans will experience at least one major depressive episode in their lifetime. And the number is a little less for seasonal affective disorder. It's about 5%. And really with depression, it ranges from like 5 to 20% for most Americans, depending upon exactly how they're looking at the numbers. But seasonal affective, for like overt clinical depression, seasonal affective disorder is about 5% of like the average American. But some experts estimate that about 95% of us have some amount of like blues funk that we might get into as a relationship with the weather. Especially in those studies, they found that women, folks born with ovaries, tend to have more sensitivity to that seasonal affective tendency, and especially those of us who live in northern climates where the days are particularly short. And I will just say, I have some clients who deal with depression, and one of the many multifaceted ways that they support themselves is to seek out sunny vacations in those darker months, because it does get pretty cold for those of us in this northern hemisphere and pretty dark, and that can have an influence on our mood. We do see that depression and seasonal affective, and as well as anxiety and all those things, are increasing in adults, and they're also increasing in our youth. And the youth, especially young adults, tend to be the most affected age group when it comes to depression as well as anxiety. And we see that in the LGBTQAI, trans, non-binary, like all those communities, there's just a lot of pressure going on in those communities. And we see a really high level in those youth. So up to like 58% of youth in that community can experience depression. And that's really pretty unfortunate. And there are a lot of things that we can do to support ourselves. Medications are one of the options, but they're not the only one. And we're going to focus mainly on the non-medical options that we may have. Anxiety, for the record, is technically the most common mental health condition in the United States. And that is also kind of approximately 20% of the population. But I will say, as a somewhat anxious person myself, that was my own journey into herbalism, happened around anxiety after a traumatic event. And I attract a lot of clients who are dealing with anxiety. It seems like it's more than 20%, at least in the populations that I work with and know. There are a lot of theories around depression as far as why it occurs in people and the things that influence or increase the likelihood of it being there or increase the severity of it. There's a lot that we still really simply don't know. And every individual person is different as well. So many people will have more than one of these factors going on, but for some people, it may be more of one or more of another, different ones for different people. So things to keep in mind include, of course, the main theory being around low serotonin. So serotonin is one of our mood boosting neurotransmitters. And that is the mechanism at which a lot of our typical antidepressive medications work on, is by increasing serotonin levels. So those SSRIs like Prozac and Paxil and all of that, those are working on the premise that depression is caused by low serotonin, and by increasing serotonin, we can ease depression. And there are some herbs that we'll talk about today that seem to have some benefit for serotonin as well. But that's really only one theory, and it doesn't work for everybody. It can be very helpful for some people, but not for everybody. There are some other neurotransmitters that are often targeted. Dopamine and norepinephrine are pretty common ones, especially norepinephrine. You might occasionally hear about a drug, instead of just being an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, they may also be a SNRI, or selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Basically, by reducing the reuptake, you reduce the breakdown of those neurotransmitters and end up with a net increase via those medications. So those tend to play a big role in mood. Also, GABA is a more relaxing neurotransmitter. And that one we tend to see a lot more involvement when we're looking at supporting folks with, say, anxiety. And a lot of our anti-anxiety medications, like the benzodiazepines, tend to work more via that GABA neurotransmitter. We're not going to focus as much on anxiety, although some of the herbs that we'll talk about are more helpful for folks who are experiencing anxiety, and some of the herbs that we'll talk about are less helpful for those who are experiencing anxiety. We also have other hormones in the body. So we do have hormones related to stress that are closely related to those neurotransmitters, but then we also have just typical like stress hormones. So things like adrenaline and cortisol. We have the HPA axis, which is the way, I'm not going to get too much into it, but it's basically how our brain communicates with hormone producing glands elsewhere in the body, like the adrenals, and how that functions can play a role in how we're feeling. The thyroid deserves a shout out because it relates to how like quickly or slowly things happen in the body. And when it is out of balance, that can be profoundly impactful for our mood. And one of the things I would want to have done if I was in charge of such things would be when somebody comes in and they're experiencing depression, would love to rule out some things if they could rule that out with their doctors. And one of them would be a thyroid condition, because they are really common, again, especially in women and folks born with ovaries, and especially as we go through hormonal shifts and as we age. Reproductive hormones can also play a role. So, for example, in folks who are born with ovaries, as we go through peri and postmenopause, those shifts can impact mood, especially like during and just after the wobble phase. Sometimes mood actually gets better a little bit later on, but during those severe wobbles of hormones, that can be really destabilizing. For folks who are born with testes, usually they have a little bit less impact from hormones, but it can still happen. Certainly folks of all genders, all ages, all races can experience depression. But for folks who are aging and maybe you're experiencing like low testosterone or what they might call andropause, that also can sometimes give people this sort of sluggish, low mood, because testosterone, as well as progesterone, as well as estrogen, all have some potential for mood boosting. I'd say testosterone usually is a little bit higher up on that scale. Blood sugar imbalance is another really big one that I tend to look at for patterns with my clients, especially if it seems to be around certain times of day. If they're like in the afternoon, I just really get a slump, or if I'm eating a certain way, I just really feel, kind of down in the dumps. Or, if I'm looking at what they're eating and I see that it's a lot of really processed carbohydrate things, or they have a lot of other signs that they might have blood sugar dysregulation, I may look at supporting that mainly through the diet, mainly through adding protein, adding fiber, more vegetables, making the carbohydrates more complex and usually smaller portion sizes, increasing activity, all those things, maybe some herbs as well, but usually the diet is one of our big areas to support blood sugar. And people are often really amazed at what a difference that makes in many things, including mood. So it's certainly not the only factor, but it can influence our mood and depression. There are certain nutrient deficiencies like B vitamins, B12, iron, which some people might be low in. Also, if you're not doing a good job methylating your B vitamins or detoxifying in your body properly through methylation, that can also impact mood as well. Omega-3s, there are a lot of nutrients that are really important for mood stability. And so if somebody isn't getting or absorbing them from their diet, and maybe supplements, that can influence mood as well. And I see those as low-hanging fruit. Like if somebody is down in the dumps because their iron and their B is low, like you want to try to figure out why and support that. But sometimes just making sure that they're getting more of those foods or some supplements can create a really positive impact there. And then sometimes that's just not what it is for that person. Microbiome and gut health are also very important, especially for some people. So especially if I see that there's a lot of gut dysregulation, or if, maybe everything was fine and then they went on antibiotics and now their mood is really quirky, I might wonder more about that for those folks. I'm an herbalist. I don't diagnose, but as an herbalist, I do look for patterns and I will refer people to their physicians for assessment and testing and those kinds of things. Inflammation is a biggie. So I'd say, serotonin and neurotransmitters are the most accepted potential underlying cause or trigger for depression. But inflammation is also getting up there in recognition of affecting our mood and potentially causing depression. And some of our herbs that support mood seem to work, at least in part, by reducing inflammation in the body, the brain, and so forth. So that's a really interesting one. And we may see that particularly if folks have chronic disease, or if they've had an infection or some other kind of weird thing like that that has created systemic inflammation in their body or brain. Trauma, of course, our lived experiences can affect our mood, whether it's childhood or later in life. Those negative experiences can really impact how our brain is wired and how it responds to things in an effort to protect us, usually, but it sometimes has its downstream negative effects. Our genetics, which again goes to like methylation, what our genetic predisposed tendencies, what we inherited from our family, like on a biological level, but then there's also inherited trauma. So folks who come from a lot of trauma in their ancestors' lives may be more predisposed for anxiety or depression or those kinds of things. It doesn't mean we can't do something about it. There's always something we can do something about, but it can help to know or suspect where your individual patterns are, because that might help you choose what approaches you combine in your own personal routine, or that you work with your practitioners to help combine in your own personal like routine strategy. Community connections are huge. We know that loneliness is potentially a recipe for depression, and that by creating those community connections in our lives, that can be profoundly healing without like anything else. That alone just can be really, really helpful for folks. And having that sense of life purpose, like feeling like you have a reason to get up, a purpose in the world. It doesn't have to be earth shattering. You don't have to be famous. But having a sense of life purpose is also something that can be really helpful, or not having it may be something that is triggering. For example, if somebody is retiring or going through a major life change, or going through a health change, those might be things that affect our sense of life purpose. So when we're looking to support folks, we really want to be looking at it holistically and not just saying like, what's the thing, whether it's a medication, an herb, a supplement, like just say like, I want the thing that makes me feel better. That's great. That's important. There are definitely quote unquote things that can help us, but really will tend to have the most positive impact, especially over the long haul, if we look at the individual and then we take a multifaceted and holistic approach. And so that can be, going through assessment to rule out with your various practitioners, or to some extent on your own, what are your causes and triggers? What are your underlying patterns? What are your energetics and constitution, which is kind of a whole conversation in itself, but like, do you run hot? Well, cooling herbs might be better. Do you run cold? Then maybe the warming herbs would be better. Are you dry or damp or sluggish or overstimulated? Like those basic, like innate tendencies, we have different herbs to address them and bring them in balance. So if you can kind of identify what's going on, that might help you pick at least the overall theme of herbs. It doesn't mean that you couldn't use an herb that's, like I'm hot and I want to use, some warming herb per se. You could do it, but you may want to balance the overall approach accordingly. You'll also want to think about like what's realistic and doable. It's probably going to have to be baby steps. Often when people are experiencing depression, they don't have a lot of motivation. They don't feel great. They're really sluggish. It can be really, fatiguing and exhausting and overwhelming to do a lot of things. So trying to figure out like what's most likely to be impactful, doable, and that is going to be realistic for that person, and then gradually, slowly kind of adding in additional supports for that person based off of what's most likely to be helpful and what's most likely to be doable for them. So there can be diet, there can be lifestyle changes, there can be things in their daily habits, there can be things like therapy, which can be tremendously supportive, especially if you get the right kind of therapy and the right therapist for you. Possibly herbs, which we'll be talking about, possibly medications. Now, some medications are going to limit which herbs are safe to use alongside, but there is definitely a place for medications in the toolkit, especially for some people. So there's that. That can be tremendously life-saving for some people. Also, if somebody is pregnant or nursing or has allergies, those are other things that may limit which herbs or approaches might be appropriate for that person. I will say for the record, pregnancy and nursing, not really my specialty. Herb drug interactions, I'll mention a few of the biggies, but it's definitely not going to be an all like encompassing talk today on that. So you'll want to do more digging, maybe seek professional guidance in that support. And often it's a team-based healthcare approach. It's hard for anybody to do things all alone. Like some people get there, but most people do better with support. And that can be conventional, like prescribing physicians, that can be natural practitioners, that can be therapists, that could be like the client itself, themselves are part of that team. Also family and friends and, pets, trees, plants, there are a lot of creatures and beings that are part of our team or can be. So when we're looking at the natural options for immune support, you don't have to do all of them, at least not right away, but it is helpful to remember that there are a lot of things outside of just meds and just herbs that are helpful, often incredibly helpful. And it's even better if we take a multifaceted approach and combine a few that are going to be the most impactful for that person. So exercise, especially cardiovascular exercise, but exercise in general, really, 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 really helpful. It's one of the most effective things in clinical trials for mood, sometimes even better than the medications, especially when it comes to remission. So incorporating that into the lifestyle. With diet, watching the blood sugar balance, watching the carbohydrates, not no carbs, but just not like tons of carbs, making sure to balance things with protein and veggies and all that. And just in general, produce. A lot of studies, or at least a handful, do show that when folks are eating more fresh produce, more fruits and vegetables, that they tend to have less depression. Now, that's mostly not, there are a few clinical trials where they've actually put it in as an intervention, but most of them are just looking at habits. So it's also possible that people who have less depression just find an easier time cooking with fruits and vegetables. But if you've ever gone through a phase of your life where you're eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, they can be cooked as well, but just like vibrant, not processed foods, you'll often feel your body saying, you can just feel that it's more uplifting versus eating, say, like a lot of processed and pro-inflammatory foods. Stress management, a gratitude journal is something super duper simple. Just writing down like 3 things that went well or 3 things that you're grateful for every day, even if, big or small, even if bad things happen, but just recognizing those good things that do happen, that has been shown in studies to enhance the happiness set point by about 25% alone. And it's a really easy thing. It's definitely something I've done in my own life when I was a bit more on the pessimistic side, and it really did help shift my mindset quite a bit. Getting good quality sleep, not too much, but also not too little. Sometimes that can be elusive, but prioritizing sleep. When we're not sleeping well, it is near impossible to be in a good mood. So if we can improve somebody's sleep when it's out of balance, that often will have a lot of really lovely side benefits for the mood. Sunlight therapy, light therapy, so getting out in sunlight, but also like exposure to a light. If like you're in a darker climate, you could put a little blues buster light bulb in your desk lamp, or use a more full-fledged like medical device light lamp, and that can be really, really helpful for the folks, particularly who are dealing with the more seasonal affective mood stuff. Nutrients, possibly vitamin D. It seems like if we have more vitamin D, there is a correlation with less depression. It's not as clear whether or not supplementing vitamin D makes as big of a difference, but vitamin D, potentially omega-3 fatty acids from fatty fish. They find that the communities, even in those really northern climates that should be super depressed because it's so dark, those that eat lots of wild-caught fatty fish like salmon and sardines and all of that tend to have much lower incidence of depression than you would expect for those darker climates. Sure, it's not the only thing, but it's definitely one of the biggies. Vitamin B12 and other B vitamins, iron if somebody is deficient. Here's a pretty neat study that they did where they combined outdoor walks with sunlight, some B vitamins, some selenium, some vitamin D, and they found that that was really helpful for mood. And then also those things that I mentioned, looking at what's going on with that person and what's needed. So is their thyroid sluggish? Then they probably want to work with their physician to supplement with thyroid hormone, because that's going to be the most appropriate remedy for that. If their blood sugar is dysregulated, then the diet shifts, the exercise, but maybe they also need herbs or medications that specifically target that. So really catering it. So I do have some basic safety rules. As I mentioned, I'm not a doctor, so I cannot diagnose or prescribe. And this class tonight really is just for educating. And you are going to want to do more due diligence to decide what is right for you. And probably that will mean working with some kind of a healthcare provider or multiple healthcare providers, depending upon their specialties. If you are going to be doing self-care, I really, really strongly recommend that you research your plants from at least a couple different good quality sources to get to know each herb, not just tonight's class. listen to your body or intuition to see if it's resonating, and then later to see if it's actually working. You might find out more quickly whether or not the plant agrees. Usually you'll know within a few days to a week or so, but you may not be able to tell if it's working for a longer period of time, depending upon the herb and how fast it works. So always start with a little bit, make sure it agrees with you, and then you can gradually work up to the dose. Ensure the identity 100%. Check in with your pharmacist or herbalist for herb drug interactions if you're on pharmaceuticals. And if you're pregnant or lactating, definitely seek additional info, because a lot of the herbs we're going to discuss today are not necessarily safe in pregnancy or lactation. So I just mentioned some of these. I will note that some of the herbs that we're going to talk about today do interact with medication. So St. John's wort's the biggie, which we will discuss, and also some of the other serotonin boosting remedies that we'll discuss near the beginning. You'd want to be really careful with other serotonin boosting meds like antidepressants, and several other classes of meds boost serotonin. And then there are some other odds and ends, like if you're taking calming herbs and a sedating med, that could be synergistic and make you feel more sedated. So there are things to be careful of. Many of the herbs we'll talk about can be safely worked with alongside some medications, but you'll want to find out and make sure that it's right for your combination. Please do not cease medication without your doctor's supervision. And usually, if it's even appropriate to go off of a medication, a really, really, really slow weaning process is better, usually after putting in supports to help somebody feel a lot better to start with. And sometimes the herbs just aren't as good as the medications for some people. So, and there's no shame in that. It's just different things work better for different people. And this is just about knowing all of our options and not about saying one is inherently better or worse. Certainly medications are overprescribed and do have some serious side effects, but they can also be life-saving and may be the best option. And not everybody has the side effects of the meds. And therapy also very supportive. So let's see, we have a question. Would you be able to recommend reputable resources or sites for cross-checking pharmaceuticals with herbs? So I would say that Mosby's is one of my very basic resources. If you go to the very last slide, or one of the last slides is going to have general resources. There's one for science, and that science, some of those science resources tend to get into it. Memorial Sloan Kettering is pretty good from a buy herb perspective, and that's on my website under the science section, which you'll get a slide much later for that, but it's a good question. Also working with a practitioner who's trained in that, which is usually going to be the pharmacists. They're super busy, but sometimes they have time to talk about it. And some herbalists and naturopathic doctors, those folks usually have more training. Always keep your doctor in the loop, but they don't always have the training in herb drug interactions like other practitioners might. So we did a pretty good job getting those basics out of the way. And now we'll get to our favorite uplifting herbs. So I am going to start off with some of our classic ones that we tend to think about and hear about as like quote unquote antidepressant, but there are a lot of other categories that are helpful as well. This particular chart comes from my Body into Balance book, and it goes from like really stimulating plants all the way to really sedating plants. So kind of like the nervous endocrine system continuum for herbs. When we're looking at mood, we're mostly going to be looking kind of in that mid-range, maybe a little bit stimulating, maybe a little bit relaxing, depending upon what's going on for that person. We usually don't want to be too sedating in somebody with a tendency to depression, especially if it's really sluggish depression, because it might exacerbate that. But usually we also don't want to hype people so much up either. So kind of in that mid-range, some of the adaptogens, we'll talk about that and what that means, some nervines and other herbs, and we will define those terms later. These are fun underlined things. There is a whole big adaptogen chart that you can check out if you want to. So some of the most popular categories of herbs that we'll think about, one is kind of those classic quote unquote antidepressant herbs, or it'd be more appropriate to call them just uplifting herbs. These herbs seem to act on serotonin and sometimes other neurotransmitters as well. That might be one of the ways in which they boost mood. There are also anti-inflammatory herbs that seem to have a mood effect. There are more energizing adaptogenic herbs that help your body adapt to stress, but also stimulate. And so that's something you'll want to be thinking about. Like, is there inflammation? Then maybe you want to think more about those anti-inflammatory herbs. Is somebody feeling more sluggish, fatigued, sleeping too much, that kind of thing? Maybe the more energizing adaptogens, especially in the morning, might be more helpful for that person. But if they're already like super jittery and not sleeping, maybe those aren't going to be as helpful. Maybe we'd want to go for those calming nervines, which are some of the most broadly safe herbs, but sometimes they work really well, and sometimes they may need to be combined with some of these other herbs. And then also many aromatic herbs have a mood lifting property. So like, we're not going to talk about it today, but rose is a very like aromatic, heart gladdening, kind of an old term for just sort of making the heart feel warm and happy. And a lot of those are aromatic, so they have a nice smell and taste. So classic quote unquote antidepressants, these are the ones that affect serotonin and neurotransmitter. At least that seems to be partly how they work. The most famous is St. John's wort. We have other options as well. We'll also talk about mimosa, which is what's pictured here, highly worth considering. Some slight newcomers, saffron and cannabis, are getting increasingly popular, so we'll mention them briefly. And they may or may not be comparable to the medications that affect serotonin, like the Prozac and the Zoloft and all that. Some studies suggest that they're like not too bad, but they don't always work for everybody. And usually the dose and the duration really matters as well. So that can be a factor. Sometimes they take a while to kick in. We have a variety of serotonin boosting remedies. Probably the biggest hitters when it comes to serotonin, one is St. John's wort that we're going to talk about. St. John's wort's cool, but it has a lot of herb drug interactions. Not only can it affect meds that interact, that produce serotonin or support serotonin rather in the body and increase the risk of serotonin syndrome, which is a potentially deadly condition. But there are a whole bunch of other herb drug interactions that specifically St. John's wort has. So it can affect your liver enzymes and like interact with more than half of the medications on the market. So that is one of the big downsides to St. John's wort, is that it has so many interaction possibilities. And so if somebody really wanted to support serotonin, but didn't want to work with didn't want to work with St. John's wort, you could try 5-HTP or tryptophan. And those are other sort of steps in that process of making serotonin. 5-HTP turns into tryptophan, and then that turns into serotonin in the body. And you'll still have the risk of serotonin syndrome, but those two don't have the risks of all the other herb drug interactions that St. John's wort has. So it's just like a little differentiation there. My experience as an herbalist is mostly with the St. John's wort. Also, whenever we're really doing a big boost to serotonin, there are some people who are less likely to respond positively to that and may respond negatively. So folks with a tendency towards bipolar tendencies, or even folks who are kind of subclinical, like maybe they don't have full-on bipolar, but they might get into those like slightly depressed or hypomanic, manic episodes. Serotonin can sometimes be aggravating for that. So that's something to be aware of as well. So if you know that somebody has that tendency to really swing a lot and get into like a manic or hypomanic state, hypo meaning like it's not quite full-blown mania, but it's kind of a little bit on the edge of that, you might not want to start with these herbs. You might want to opt for other ones that we'll talk about instead. And I already mentioned serotonin syndrome. So St. John's wort, I have to start here because it's the most famous, best researched herb, even though there are a lot of reasons that we just mentioned that it doesn't agree with a lot of people, the drug interactions, and potentially also those bipolar tendencies. So St. John's wort is very well researched. There are at least 100 clinical studies where they study people, they compare it to placebo or a drug. It's not just, correlations, it shows a definite improvement. And many of the studies show a somewhat comparable effect to adequately dosed St. John's wort and the antidepressant medications, at least at like a lower-ish dose of the medications. They do take a while to kick in. So St. John's wort tends to take at least 6 weeks, sometimes more, to fully kick in. And if somebody is self-treating for depression, that might be just too long. So it's interesting about St. John's wort that it performs very well in the studies, but anecdotally, when I talk to folks, when I used to work in natural food stores, when I'm teaching classes amongst my clients, it's a really mixed bag. I know a lot of people have tried it and a lot of people felt like it really didn't do it for them. And I don't, sometimes it might just be that it wasn't the right option for them, but it could also be that it was a low quality product, that it was not enough of a dose, and or that they didn't stick with it for long enough. That said, if somebody is hurting, I want them to get to whatever answer is going to help them out fastest. So even if I did work with St. John's wort, I would want to combine it with something that was going to be a little bit faster acting. So let's see, some things that you can combine it with anything really, but lemon balm and maybe turmeric are potential options for combos. The typical dose in studies is about 300 milligrams of a standardized extract 2 or 3 times a day. The studies range from about 600 milligrams to 1500 milligrams daily, but 300 3 times a day, pretty typical. The most studied one is this Nature's Way Perica, but there are a lot of other products that seem to be pretty similar on the market. And that one's actually not that expensive. It's not as easy to find in stores, but it's the one that has funded most of the research on St. John's wort. Carbon dioxide extractions are pretty good if you can find those. And then fresh plant tinctures, which are alcohol extracts. And this is a picture of me making some. And it's fun because it's these yellow flowers, but it turns like blood red when you extract it. And the redder, the better. These pigments are hypericin and hyperforin, and they are really good. They might be part of what makes the St. John's wort effective, but they're also really good markers for good quality St. John's wort. And so I picked up fresh plant tinctures that had been sitting around a shelf for a really long time, and it was more on the brown side, and that is probably not going to be as effective as a really deep red. So you can harvest your own St. John's wort. It does grow in the wild, and it's all about the sun. Like, this is a very sunshine plant. It seems to support serotonin. It seems to support norepinephrine. It seems to have a very brightening, protective kind of action, and it loves to grow in those really sunny spots. It loves to bloom on the sunniest days of the year. It's definitely an herb to consider, possibly for depression as well as in folks with seasonal affective. It is usually best fresh or freshly dried, but most of what's sold dried on the market isn't very good. So I usually prefer fresh buds and flowers predominantly. So here is a neat study that I just pulled up from 2023. I love when I can find a systematic review or a meta-analysis where they look at a whole bunch of clinical trials and then summarize it in a chart. And so they picked, I think it was 12 studies here that had been out somewhat recently. And if you want to, later on the slides, you can really play around with looking with it, but I'll just explain it if you're not used to looking at studies. So each one of these is a different study. They show the sample size is how many people. HAM-D is the test, like it's a little score that people will fill out on a little test to see where they lie and how severe the depression is. And I've got a little thing coming up on what numbers. So basically, the higher that mean number here, the worse their depression was at the beginning of the study as the average, the mean across all of the study participants. We've got our age groups, genders, how long the study was, which is kind of helpful to know, and then what their interventions was. So this was, some of these are drugs. We've got things like Prozac and Paxil and other mostly serotonin boosting drugs, or a placebo. And then we've got the St. John's wort dose if they were comparing. And then in here, we see the number of people that responded. So like 79 versus 111 responded to this sertraline, which I gotta look at my little cheat sheet here, is the Zoloft. And then the mean HAM-D score is like what it came to. So it started off at around 20 and the average was down to 10. So it was about a 50% improvement, which is pretty cool. Let me minimize my camera so I can get over here. And then we actually got an even lower mean score, which is better, of the folks who were taking the St. John's wort. And this SD means like plus or minus, like, so, the average was about 8.68 was their final score, but it varied by, so many points. That's what the plus or minus is here. So that's how you can read that if you are nerdy like me, and the link here will bring you to the full study. Some basic takeaways that we see in this study is 14 studies here, that basically there was a benefit for depression and fewer side effects than the medications. That's kind of the main takeaway for most of the studies on St. John's wort. Generally, we see, if we're looking at all those individual studies that they reviewed, that there was a generally good, sometimes even better than medication effect on that HAM-D score. The lower score is a better thing. And that often more people actually responded to St. John's wort than responded to the medication. But when it came to major depression, while more people responded positively to St. John's wort than to the meds, the actual change in depression scores was not quite as big for St. John's wort versus the meds. So, while it does seem to be helpful, it may not be as helpful. And major depression tends to be a trickier thing for any remedy alone. Usually a multifaceted approach is better. Other studies show kind of similar things for mild to moderate or even major depression. And generally, we see pretty good response rates with the herb, and lower discontinuation, better remission, that things don't tend to come back quite as easily. But sometimes it's not quite as strong. So for example, with this one here, actually, no, the St. John's wort was actually better in this particular study, but not always. And I will say there are people I have met who St. John's wort was okay, and then the medication was better for them. So it really depends on the individual. Basic cautions, the two that I already mentioned are the biggest. It may affect thyroid hormones in a not so great way. There's really not a lot of evidence there, but I'd just be cautious. Some people, especially fair-skinned folks in summertime, might get increased risk of sun rash. And it is kind of slow acting. So mimosa or albizia, this is another one that's pretty good to know about. It's a little harder to find in commerce, but there are a couple different companies that make it. You might see it labeled as mimosa, albizia. The Latin name is Albizia julibrescens. And it's also known as the tree of happiness or silk tree. So different companies might label it differently. And you can get it as a pill, you can get it as a tincture, you can get it as a dry herb if you look around enough. Even though I'm teaching this in cooperation with the co-op today, I am not really taking into mind what they do or don't carry. So they may or may not carry these things, but I'm just giving you info. And I have no real financial ties to what they sell there. I'm not tied to any company. So traditional Chinese medicine is where we tend to know this herb from. It is very invasive across the mid-Atlantic of the United States and some of those other warmer zones. It's a little too cold for it here in New Hampshire, but I have seen it as a beautiful ornamental tree in Massachusetts, as well as in New Orleans. There are a couple really famous places that have gorgeous mimosa trees. It's really pretty, but it can also be super invasive in some areas. The good news is that if you can find an organic farm that it's invasive on, you might be able to get some harvests from them. And or if you're in that area, you might be able to find it. Don't plant it in those areas where it's invasive, but you might be able to find it. You can also find it in commerce. So what I love about this plant is, even though there's almost no research on it, there's a long history of use of this plant in Chinese medicine and other Asian medicines for uplifting the spirits, improving happiness, and it's faster acting than St. John's wort. And it seems to work better across the board in my clinical experience and in many of my colleagues' clinical experience than St. John's wort. So it's one that I actually turn to a lot more often. And while there are a few cautions to be aware of, it doesn't seem to have as many interaction potentials as St. John's wort as well. So while there's very little data, there's just not a lot of research on it. There's a lot of tradition, but not a lot of research. It seems to probably be okay alongside those antidepressant medications. I'd still approach it carefully and just listen to the body. It does tend to work pretty quickly. So usually like within a day, people will feel a little bit of improvement. And then as time goes on, they'll feel more. It seems to be particularly helpful for grief and heartache and helping people who are transitioning through those big things. It's a little bit calming, seems to be a little bit like anxiety easing as well without being sedating. So that's really nice. It may help people work through their trauma, although it may bring it up to the surface when you first start taking it. So I usually will recommend, if I have a client who is dealing with trauma, which, you know, some people are dealing with more than others, but a lot of people have trauma, that it's a good one to have when you have that support network, when you're going to therapy, or when you're about to have like a really good lunch date with a really supportive friend or something like that, where you have that opportunity to allow that trauma to come to the surface so that you can address it and work through it. And it seems to help that process, but you want to be aware that it could bring it up to the surface. Also, like with what I mentioned about serotonin boosters, it may agitate folks with a tendency for bipolar, mania, or hypomania. So be aware of that as well. But generally pretty well tolerated by most people and usually pretty fast acting. It's definitely one of my favorites. You can work with the flowers. Those are classic in Asian medicine, but the bark is a little bit stronger, and that's where my experience is. And I believe this is me harvesting the bark here in that picture. And I've got some lists of different places that sell it. I have no major ties to any of these places, just letting you know, because it's a little harder to find. You could also make a tea. My experience is mainly with making a fresh or dry plant tincture. And you can sometimes find it in pill form, but that's a little less common. So that is that plant. Just checking the timeline, not too bad. So the next one I want to talk about is saffron. And I will say for the record that this is a plant I have very little personal experience with, but it's getting a lot of press lately. It's getting a lot of attention. And it is kind of fun. So I thought I'd add it to the mix, but just I want to give that caveat that of the herbs that we're discussing, it's one of the ones that I don't have a lot of clinical experience with. So saffron's starting to pop up in research. It probably does have some history of use for supporting mood, but there are a handful of studies, maybe 10s, 20s, somewhere in there, of either depression or something related to mood, like depression in folks who have MS, or depression in folks who are going through menopause, or there are a couple of studies like that. Most of the studies are still pretty small, but they're showing some interesting benefit. So this is a plant. It pops up either in the spring or the fall, depending upon the specific one. And we've got these little styles that are the stigma that are in the middle. And the three of those are what we're actually working with saffron. And they only bloom for a really short period of time. So you really just have like a day to harvest the ones that have opened. We are seeing more saffron farms popping up in places like New Hampshire. There's like an organic one right down the road from me. Vermont has several saffron farms nowadays. You also see it on the West Coast. So it will actually grow pretty well, but it is a very tedious harvest, and it is one of the most expensive spices because it's just this tiny little bit that we can only harvest for a little while. What's cool about saffron is that it seems to be very helpful for mood. It may act on the serotonin, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, but in the few studies that we have, it doesn't seem to pose a negative risk with the SSRI medications. So I would still approach it cautiously because we're very much still learning about this, but the research that we have thus far suggests that it's safe to combine. It seems to improve happiness in the studies, reduce depression. It does seem to have a possibly sort of similar efficacy rate to the medications in the studies, with a 90% or more remission rate, which is pretty good. So keeping people from having another episode of depression during the time frame that they did the study, at least. It also is a neuro anti-inflammatory. So while it seems to work on that neurotransmitter, serotonin-y type piece of things, it's also potentially working on that anti-inflammatory, that whole concept that when we are in an inflamed state, the brain and the neurotransmitters are more apt to lean towards depression. And this one is a very profound anti-inflammatory for the brain. So folks who are dealing with that might find this particularly helpful. It is also a nootropic, fun little word, basically means brain boosting. So it is a cognitive support herb as well. It's kind of a funky flavor. It's very bright and yellowy red color. You can take it in a lot of different formats. It is really expensive, but you don't necessarily need a really big dose. That said, you know, some studies like this one, they did a tea, which probably wasn't the strongest way of using it. They used 30 milligrams of the stigmas, which is one stigma is 2 milligrams. That's like 15 of these little things. So that's what's that, 5 flowers worth of harvest going into each cup of tea. And they boiled that for 10 to 15 minutes once a day and found efficacy from that. I know Thomas Easley, who talks a lot about saffron and how helpful it is in a lot of different scenarios. He does a 1 to 10 tincture of the dry stigmas in 40% alcohol. He really likes percolating that and then taking 5 to 10 drops 3 times a day. So it's a pretty low dose. 5 to 10 drops is on the lower side for most herbs, whereas many other herbs we might take like 1 to 5 mils, which might be 30 to 1,500 drops, for example. So it's a much lower dose. So that's the pro side, that even though it's pretty expensive, you don't need as much. It's fun because when you add it to the water, it turns the water yellow as well, because it's just so the pigments and the aroma are where a lot of the healing properties are. It seems to probably be safe with meds. There are some possible side effects in the studies. So about 3% of people in the studies had sleep disturbances. Either they were not sleeping as well or they were oversleeping. And about 6% had GI upset. So not huge, but something to be aware of. Cannabis, I just want to touch on, it's not my area of expertise as well. And as an herbalist in the state of New Hampshire, it's not something that I personally like dole out or recommend for my clients, but it comes up a lot. So certainly there are anti-inflammatory and serotonin boosting properties and other neurotransmitter supportive properties to cannabis. Seems to be with the CBD, the CBDA, 100 times more potent in binding to serotonin receptors versus our body's natural serotonin, which is interesting. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, to be honest. CBD seems to bind to dopamine receptors, and then there are some of the aromatic terpenes like linalool and limonene that are more calming and uplifting of those aromatic terpenes in it. A lot of people report that they get mood lifting effects from cannabis, and it's certainly one of the reasons why people turn to medical cannabis as well as recreational cannabis. But there are some downsides as well that I just want to mention, especially when people are using like higher doses, you know, heavy users. There can be this addictive and withdrawal effect from it, where when you stop taking it, you get like more agitated and more depressed. There can be a more sedating effect to some cannabis that can just kind of zap people's motivation as well. It can reduce REM sleep, which is our deep sleep, dream sleep. It enhances deep sleep, but it's at the detriment of REM sleep or dream time. And dream time is when we kind of like deal with the crud that happens to us. You know, our brain kind of works through things, and both REM sleep and deep sleep are really, really important for mood. And we see a reduction of REM sleep when we're on cannabis. So that could potentially be a downside as well. And there is also unclear safety regarding the serotonin syndrome, liver clearance of drugs, and all of that. So I just want to be cautious about that. If you are thinking about working with it, or you already are, I would suggest like starting with low doses and using the minimum effective dose. So not taking super high doses. That is probably going to be worse. And definitely in younger brains, it seems to be not great. And cannabis use and overuse has also been linked to increased mental health conditions as well. So pros and cons. I'm not like a big yay cannabis or anti-cannabis person. I just want to give you some food for thought there. So anti-inflammatory, things that are going to reduce inflammation in the brain and the body that may result in mood boosting aspects. We mentioned saffron already. That's certainly a biggie. The other real biggie that we'll talk about is turmeric, which had some surprising cool research on it. Also, many herbs that we'll mention or that we're not going to mention today are potentially helpful. So like lemon balm, holy basil, we'll talk about lion's mane, cannabis, rosemary, bacopa, lots of others might be helpful here. So turmeric, this one surprised me. Several years ago, they did a handful of studies, clinical trials, where they compared the turmeric to Prozac for major depression. And like, I never would have thought of turmeric as being a mood boosting herb per se. And I still don't know that it's my first go-to, but it was still really fascinating research. So in this particular study, they compared the generic form of Prozac to a standardized curcumin extract of turmeric. And they found that it was comparable for major depression and actually even better when you combine them. So both Prozac and turmeric or curcumin individually were about 65% improvement in major depression in those studies, which is pretty decent. Not enough for some people, but pretty decent. When they combine the turmeric and the Prozac together, it actually created an 80% efficacy rate, which is impressive and good to know that it seems to be safe to combine them. So that also makes me wonder, like, could we combine turmeric with our herbs, maybe with the mimosa or the saffron or the St. John's wort or some of the other herbs we'll talk about. So you might think about combining it in your daily protocol or in your actual remedy for a little mood support, especially if there's already a lot of inflammation going on in that person. If it seems like inflammation is part of your patterns, it might be worth looking to. So studies use 500 milligrams of curcumin extract in a pill twice daily for 8 weeks. You could probably work with it in more whole traditional forms as well, like golden milk. We've got a recipe there, adding it to food, especially with a little fat and maybe some black pepper. There are some possible contraindications as well as adulteration. So you want to make sure you're getting your turmeric from trustworthy sources. And it doesn't agree with everybody. Sometimes it causes some upset stomach. It might be a little blood thinning. It maybe might affect liver enzyme pathways, but not as much as like black pepper or St. John's wort. Black pepper tends to prolong how long drugs are in the system, and St. John's wort tends to clear them out more quickly. Turmeric, it seems to have an effect, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be clinically relevant, that it necessarily is enough to matter. So next up, and let's see, time-wise, we got about a half an hour. We're doing pretty well as far as my proposed timeline here. Hopefully I'm not going too fast for you all. Energizing adaptogens. So adaptogens are herbs that help our body adapt to stress. They're often also a little bit more on the energizing effect. And by adapt to stress, I mean that we become more resilient to stress. Like life throws crud at you and you just kind of handle it a little better. And the ones that I'm going to focus on right now are the ones that are moderately to sometimes a little bit more stimulating in nature. So I would be thinking of these herbs, especially, you know, the studies show them to be quite good for supporting folks with depression. I would particularly think about them for people who are more sluggish, more fatigued, who need, you know, more get up and go, you know, they're just sleeping too much. That kind of overall pattern, I would think about adding some adaptogens. And if it was really sluggish, I might even throw a little something that's like anti-inflammatory but contains caffeine in with it, like a little green tea or a little cacao nibs or something like that. Might be nice for somebody who tolerates that little bit of extra stimulation. We're going to focus on ashwagandha and rhodiola, which are some of the most promising and pretty well tolerated by many people. But other possibilities in this general category include maca, eleuthero, cottonopsis, schizandra, and reishi. And generally, these are pretty safe alongside antidepressant medications. There are some good studies on it. And clinically, I have worked with clients who have been on antidepressants, as well as some of these adaptogens and a lot of the herbs we'll be talking about next. And they seem to go along together quite well without issue. Cautions, though, generally for these slightly stimulating to more significantly stimulating herbs, some people get overstimulated by it. Like rhodiola is a little more common. Ashwagandha sometimes, like I'm a little overstimulated by both of these plants, especially ashwagandha. And some of my clients are as well. But when we look at like bigger populations, it's pretty uncommon, especially for ashwagandha, for that to occur. But be aware, it might. So if somebody starts taking them and they start noticing that they're not sleeping well or they're feeling more anxious, it might be that our next category of herbs is better for that person. So be a little wary of that. Also, because of that little bit of stimulation, anxiety, maybe mania, usually, like, for example, ashwagandha is okay in bipolar and OCD type tendencies, but not always. And the same thing with sleep problems sometimes. There are some adaptogens that are a little gentler and even less stimulating. So shatavari, I'll just give a shout out, tends to be really good for like menopause, hormone balance, especially around estrogen, and sleep support, especially in peri and postmenopause. Holy basil, which we will talk about, magnolia, which we won't talk about. Those seem to have some stress supportive adaptogenic effects, but are a little bit more calming for most people versus being stimulating, but not usually super sedating. So, but everybody is different. So start low, listen to your body. Here's a little bit of background info on adaptogens. And so the basic rules for an adaptogen is that it's pretty safe and non-toxic, usually benefits a lot of different body systems, and has this modulating, what we might call trophorestorative or amphoteric. It tends to bring things into balance versus just pushing the body in one way or another. And it seems to work on that HPA axis, which HPA is hypothalamic, so the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal. Adrenal is the gland that puts out our stress hormones. And it seems to support the way that that axis of communication occurs. So this particular schematic is kind of cool. So they show in the average person, stress response. So you introduce a stressor, the stress response goes up, you get a little bit of stress protection, but then a lot of times people get really crashy after stress. With adaptogens in the studies they did, the stress response, the protective effect, so protecting yourself from that stress, being able to resist being like crashed by that stress, went up, but not quite as high, tended to stay more balanced, and only dipped down closer to the normal level versus crashing and then coming back. So that seems to be sort of how the adaptogens work. And another schematic over here shows kind of like if you're under lots of stress, you might normally just go punk, like the seesaw just gets into stress mode. Whereas with the adaptogens, you're just more able to stay balanced with it, which is nice, especially if you're experiencing a lot of stress or fatigue. So ashwagandha is definitely one of my favorites in the clinic, and a darling. Like, it's super trendy these days. It's been trendy for a long time, but I think it's really getting quite the heyday these days. And so this comes traditionally from Ayurveda, as well as other parts of the world like Africa and potentially also the Middle East. But most of our knowledge of it in the West tends to come from the Ayurvedic or Indian traditions. And there it is believed to have the spirit or the strength of a horse or a stallion. And the idea being that if you take the roots, consume them for 1 year, you'll have the strength of a stallion for the next 10. Lots and lots of really good research in humans on a lot of different things with this plant, including boosting mood, even potentially easing anxiety. Even though I'm saying be a little careful with that, most of the research suggests that it's helpful, and even potentially helping with sleep with many people, but not everybody. It is also a thyroid booster. So that can be great for somebody who's just like a little sluggish on thyroid. Like maybe they're not bad enough to need meds, but they're not quite in the optimal range. Ashwagandha might be helpful for those folks. Or if somebody who's on medication, the medications are working okay, but not great, ashwagandha might help for somebody who's a little sluggish on the thyroid. It also does have some sort of testosterogenic effects. It has a classic use for that more masculine energy, but it is beneficial for all genders. There are a lot of studies, for example, on women as well as in men, and likely helpful for lots of other gendered folks as well. Cautions, mainly that it is a little bit thyroid boosting. So if somebody was on thyroid meds, you'd want to make sure you're not pushing them too far with the ashwagandha. Or if somebody was hyperthyroid, this is not the plant that I would work with for them. And they may need, for the hyperthyroid, they're going to need something more specific and probably conventional, but I wouldn't add ashwagandha to that. It is in the nightshade family. Usually not an issue, but some people are sensitive to nightshades, and that like occasional person that it is overstimulating for. So some tips on how to take it. I put a little star here because we're just going to glide by, but you've got it in the slide. So pills, tinctures, hot milk, powders mixed into things, golden milk, cacao, all sorts of fun stuff. Here's a fun chai recipe. I do not love the taste of ashwagandha, I should say. It's not the best tasting, but you can combine it with our more classic masala chai spices, and that usually tastes better, if you will. And you can also put it into golden milk. Again, I like the way golden milk tastes better without the ashwagandha, but ashwagandha can be covered up a little bit by that particular recipe. Remember, this is a plant that was named after the horse because it smells like it, the ashwagandha. So rhodiola is next. This is a little tricky because it likes to grow in like high alpine and coastal cliff areas. And so sourcing it has become really tricky, but it is a pretty awesome plant. So I just wanted to mention it. So this one's a little bit more energizing. It's another brain booster. It's also anti-inflammatory to the brain and just restorative to the brain. So there may be a tie in there as well. It is really great for brain fog. So folks who are experiencing a lot of that usually and who want a little bit more stimulation usually really like rhodiola quite a bit. It's a bit energizing. There are a lot of studies on mood, especially around depression, as well as around cognition, that have found some good results. And I would still be cautious for those anxious or people who don't sleep well. So just keep an eye out. It doesn't affect everybody that way, but if you see that popping up after introducing, be suspicious of the rhodiola. There is a very long history of use for this plant for living a long life. So this plant comes from a variety of places, but also Siberia, Hungary, Russia, where a lot of its tradition of use comes from. And there they believe that if you consume it, oftentimes soaked in vodka, because yeah, basically that's a tincture, but also vodka, very popular in those areas, that you would live to be 100 years old. So it's a longevity, vitality tonic. There was one study that found it was not as effective as Zoloft in major depression, but that it had fewer side effects. And a couple other study summaries here as well. They compared it to a placebo at different dosage ranges, once or twice a day, and they found that it was like 30 to 35% reduction, so like decent but not amazing, compared to only 3% reduction for the placebo. And that people in this study also had less insomnia and more mood emotional stability. When you're sourcing it, I would highly recommend finding an organically cultivated United States grown root. It is now on the CITES list, that's CITES here. That is a list of plants that in order to protect them from overharvesting in the wild, it's now illegal to import rhodiola wild from other countries. And so for that reason, and just it's a slower growing plant to cultivate, what you do find in commerce is pretty expensive. So I would, make sure to seek out those companies that do have good quality, even though it is going to be a bit more expensive. You can combine it with other herbs, like maybe the ashwagandha, that is easier to cultivate and easier, more sustainably grown. And you don't really need big doses of this one either, like maybe 1 to 2 milliliters, which is about 30 to 60 drops once or twice a day. And you can always start with less or put it in formula. Cautions. Many of the things we already talked about, it is very drying and very astringent. So if somebody's already very dry in nature, like dry skin, dry mucous membranes, all of that, if they're taking like straight up rhodiola in pretty decent doses ongoing, they may find that they feel even drier with rhodiola. I don't normally see it too much because I'm usually working with it with other herbs in combination or just as needed for a little pick-me-up or something like that, because it is pretty fast acting. And so I don't normally see it in my own clinical practice, but if folks were, say, like really hitting it heavy as a solo herb, that could happen. Sometimes bothers stomachs. It may also overstimulate, kind of like we were talking about. So you'd want to be careful there. So calming mood nervines. We're hitting the home stretch here. So definitely be thinking, if you have questions or comments or personal stories, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and we'll try to save some time at the very end to discuss those. So this next category is really like one of my favorite categories of herbs, period, for a lot of things. They tend to help with sleep. They tend to help with mood. They tend to help with anxiety. And these are the nervines, the herbs that nourish and support the nervous system. And so some of them are calming adaptogens, like holy basil and magnolia are kind of adaptogen-like, but they also are nervines. So they're a little bit more on that like edge, like that overlapping continuum. Some of them are more nervous system relaxing, but not too sedating. And so that's going to be really nice, especially for those folks that are more anxious. They're not sleeping well. They may be more jittery. They might be really sensitive to those more stimulating herbs. You know, sometimes folks really could use mood help, but when they take a lot of your classic mood herbs, they feel agitated, they feel aggravated, they don't sleep well, they feel more anxious. So when you encounter those super sensitive folks, think about these nervines in particular, but they can be really helpful for a lot of people, and you can take them in formula with other herbs as well. So you could combine them with St. John's wort or mimosa or saffron or whatever it may be. Like a lot of these herbs do play well together in formulas, and you'll use like a little less of each herb altogether. So lemon balm and holy basil are going to be the two that we'll really talk about, but also in this category would be motherwort, bacopa, roses, damiana, magnolia, mimosa, which we already talked about, reishi, milky oat seed. I mentioned bacopa twice because I like it so much. Ashwagandha is kind of on the edge here. Wood betony, schizandra. And then if we need something a little bit more calming, some examples would be chamomile or lavender. So it really depends. You'd want to get to know each of those herbs individually instead of saying like, oh, they're all interchangeable. They're all different, but they all are, you know, calming, mood boosting, nervine herbs. But each one of them is a little different in its vibe, a little different in what its side benefits are. So you'd want to get to know it better before you started taking it or picking it out. They're not just like all the same. I also want to note that when we start to get to those more calming herbs, which we're not covering many of those in today's talk, but like chamomile and lavender would be more calming because they are more sedating. If somebody was on a medication that suppressed the central nervous system a little bit, taking these herbs alongside might increase that. So to some extent, the traditional antidepressants do that, but even more so the benzodiazepines, like your anti-anxiety and your sleep medications, some of your pain medications as well. Also things like anti-seizure medications may have a sort of sedating effect. So if you took chamomile or lavender or some other more sedating herb along with them, it could increase that. That might just mean you sleep better or you're less anxious, and that might be okay. But it's not okay if you fall asleep at the wheel, or if you're so sedated, you now have worse depression, or you have apnea and it's now worse and you're not breathing well and you're not waking up because you're not breathing well. So there's a continuum there, and it's different for different people, but I would be cautious. And if you did want to introduce those herbs, I would do it very, very, very slowly and gently. Always a good idea, but particularly with these more calming herbs. So lemon balm, love this plant. If you want to hear me talk more about it, I should have added it to the slides. Maybe I will before I update the slides. But lemon balm is really wonderful for, as I was saying with the slides, lemon balm, I've done a lot of different videos out there that are in the ether. So you can hear me talk for like a whole hour on lemon balm. But lemon balm is really easy to grow. So it's a really great backyard garden herb that is phenomenal for mood. And it's so much better when it's super duper duper fresh. And so that's why homegrown is like better than anything else, especially a fresh extract, although you do get benefits from tea, just maybe not quite as potent, but it's great in formula. So you can still throw it in tea. Like I have holy basil and lemon balm and a bunch of other herbs in my tea today. So lemon balm, very brightening, very heart gladdening, very relaxing, but uplifting at the same time. Also enhances cognition, also supportive for the heart. So if you're getting like benign palpitations or tachycardia, lemon balm tends to be helpful there. So does motherwort as an aside. And just a really, really nice herb that's pretty safe and well tolerated by almost everybody. It may not always be strong enough for everybody, but if it doesn't work enough on its own, you could easily combine it with other herbs for a little extra like background support. And so just a lovely one. It also is antiviral. It can also help support folks who have hyperthyroid, although in and of itself is probably not going to be enough. It enhances digestion. It's anti-inflammatory. Like there's just a lot to lemon balm, and it's, in a word, couple words, I think it's just calming and uplifting. And you can put the tincture in your seltzer. You could try other extracts like a glycerin or a vinegar if you didn't want to do alcohol. And it just like helps people feel like kind of you're just in a good, better place. And it blends well. So I know David Winston loves combining it with St. John's wort, for example, as 2 fresh plant tinctures. I love making those alcohol extracts with it, but you can do other forms as well. The capsules are like the weakest form, but they performed okay in studies, but I would prefer it as a fresh extract. Is lemon balm good as a hydrosol? Yes, it could be very good as a hydrosol. It just may not have a very good shelf life as a hydrosol, but it would likely be pretty phenomenal. The essential oil is super, super expensive, but making a hydrosol at home is pretty easy to do. I do have a free video out there in the ethers if you Google it. And you could totally make your own homegrown lemon balm hydrosol and then just keep the extras stored in the fridge, or maybe combine it with a tincture to stabilize it a little bit. So lots of options. One question that comes up for lemon balm pretty frequently is if it's safe in hypothyroid. And even though there were some studies that suggested it might not be, they were not done in the human body, and they were done with other herbs that were thyroid inhibiting in combo. And I really don't see any evidence that lemon balm is a problem. And I work with lemon balm a lot with folks who have hypothyroid and have not seen it negatively affect them in their thyroid scores. And I've talked to herbalists around the world, and that generally seems to be the consensus. So I'm not worried about it for thyroid, even though you'll hear it and see it even in some of my older books. Holy basil. This is, I think, our last big herb here. This is another really easy to grow plant. I say Ocimum sanctum. Tenora florum is actually the new name. And there are even in that like different species and different varieties. So this particular one that is pictured is the Kapur, which is not actually the same species, even though it's mislabeled a lot. So it's probably an Africanum. It's a lot of debate. Regardless, they're all used pretty interchangeably. And this one pictured is the one that grows the easiest in the garden. I just love, love, love this one. And it just has this like very Zen-like calm but alert state. If you watch Kung Fu movies and you see that Kung Fu master is like deftly maneuvering whatever blows are being sent their way without like getting all riled up, that's how I view holy basil. You know how you feel when you get out of yoga class or a good meditation session and you're just like, life is pretty good. Holy basil is really, really nice that way. And you can work with it in a lot of different formats. It also benefits your stress hormone production, tends to be very balancing. It's blood sugar modulating or lowering, so really good with meals, especially if there's stress and blood sugar dysregulation and cravings happening. Holy basil tends to be excellent for that. It's a brain booster. It's anti-anxiety. It's just a really nice plant. It supports digestion. It's immune boosting. There may be some thyroid inhibiting effects to this in some animal studies. I have not seen it clinically, and I work with a lot of folks who are on holy basil and a lot of folks who have thyroid issues, and we monitor their thyroid levels, and I have not seen that. It's like many of the herbs we're discussing, not necessarily appropriate in fertility, and not everybody agrees with it. Some people find that it actually makes them a little bit more anxious, but that's very rare. Most people find it very helpful for anxiety. Some studies, not a lot, but a few human trials finding it really helpful for mood and stress and neurological health. There was a neat study on generalized anxiety disorder, pretty small study though, but clinically, definitely one of my favorites. Here's a little bit onto the whole Latin name piece of things. I tend to work with the Africanum species personally. They're often like mislabeled and there's tons of debate. They're all relatively interchangeable though. Let's see. Taking it fresh is really good, or freshly dried, homegrown is awesome. You can do pills, you can do carbon dioxide extract pills, you can do glycerin extract, you can do all, whatever you want. It works really well as long as it's a good quality dried, or if it's fresh. Those are the best ways to work with it. Because it does lower blood sugar, if you were, say, drinking a strong tea or taking a lot of tincture, you would probably want to have it with food or with a little something sweet. So like I have a little honey in my tea, and then it's fine. If I was having it with a meal, I might have it unsweetened to balance my blood sugar. So wrapping up, I have a little slide on concepts for weaning off of medications, just because I know it's something a lot of people hope to do. And I don't think it's necessary for everybody to do this, but because it comes up a lot and because I see people doing it for themselves, and I don't recommend that, not just because I'm trying to cover my butt, but because folks usually spiral really, really, really badly when they decide to just take themselves off of antidepressant drugs. And even sometimes when they're working with their doctors, but the transition is too fast. I have also seen people spiral really badly. There are a lot of specific withdrawal effects of going off of them. And then in addition, you don't have the benefits of the medications. So if you were thinking about doing that, I would, one, work with your doctor, talk to your doctor. You really should have their oversight and approval on that. And I also usually would suggest having people feel as well as possible first, supporting them with diet, with lifestyle, with herbs that are safe alongside their medications, which is most of the herbs we've discussed, except, not St. John's wort probably. And I probably wouldn't use those serotonin boosting things. But for most of the other herbs that we've discussed, they seem to be totally fine, slowly introducing them alongside, say, like an SSRI type drug. And so you can add that. And a lot of times you can get people just feeling better alongside their med. And then if it seemed appropriate, then maybe they, after a while of feeling a lot better, then maybe they could start weaning off of it with their doctor's guidance, and like really, really slowly if possible. More slowly than most American doctors will do is likely better. The UK just revised their guidelines, and there are some links in your slides to see like how low and slow, and you can share that with your doctor as a suggestion. It takes longer, but usually people have more success with fewer withdrawal effects. And there's also another resource with a suggested weaning chart that, again, to discuss with your doctor and then do with your doctor's supervision if it's appropriate. Some folks, are better off staying on their medications or may need a low dose of their medications. And some people are able to transition to herbal approaches. So it really varies. And I'm not telling you to do it or not do it. I'm just giving you some food for thought in that. Where to buy herbs, and I'm about to sneeze here, maybe not. So just different sources. So your local natural food store or co-op is a great place, especially for pre-made products. Usually you can get really good, trustworthy pre-made products. Also various sources for getting seeds and seedlings. There are plenty of local places as well that are listed on my website, herb shops, herb farms to buy direct from, some of the big producers, finished remedies. Some of my favorites are listed there. And then resources, as I mentioned. So I have a lot of books, and a lot of my books do discuss this, although you did get a pretty good overview right here. I would say of all the books, the one that discusses it the most would be the Herbal Remedies for Sleep, because a lot of the herbs that affect and support sleep also support mood. I do have a blog on how to make a lot of different remedies. So if you want to see, how do I make a tea? How do I dry plants? How do I make a tincture? That blog will show you some, and will also bring you to other blogs for more detail. Andrew Weil has a pretty cool book called Spontaneous Happiness that's more on the lifestyle, but a little bit of everything. Thomas Easley has some pretty in-depth classes when they're available, and for more advanced folks. There are a lot of great books. David Winston's Adaptogens is very good for a lot of these mood herb topics as well as adaptogens. Krista Sinodinos has a self-published book that's hard to get. You have to buy it direct from her, but it's for the more advanced herb student that just wants a really strong herbal. That's a pretty good one. For free sources, Rosalie's got a great website with plant profiles on it, some of the ones that we've discussed. For safety, American Herbal Products Association Botanical Safety Handbook. And then somebody was asking before about herb drug interactions. If you go to the science links, and then from there, you can click to other resources. A lot of them will have some info, but it is usually also a good idea if you're looking for herb drug interactions to work with a practitioner. And I'll just kind of show you that real quick. Let me just pop over there, reshare my screen. So I just clicked the link and it brought me to this page of my website, which is if you scroll up, it's the Get Connected page, but further down is where it brings you to is that science section. There we go. And I would say Memorial Sloan Kettering is one of my favorites. And it's more specific to the herb. So if they have the herb you want to know about, then it might be in here. So let's see. So we'll look up S. And they probably have St. John's wort. So many herbs. Here we go. St. John's wort. You usually have to say, yes, yes, I know. This is just information. And then you can click these different tabs where you can go down to herb drug interactions, and it will list common studied herb drug interactions. And so you can see St. John's wort has a lot of them. And then you can even see the studies, and it will tell you like if there's no clinical evidence, but it's just theoretical, it will tell you that, which is nice. So those are some good resources. And lots of info on me. You can order my books. You can register for a class. I have lots of classes coming up. I have my mailing list. You can find me online on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And I do consultations, although my availability is super limited. So any questions, comments, or feedback in these last few minutes? And thank you for listening to me talk rapidly for the last hour and a half. I hope this was helpful.
Awesome. It looks like there's one question in the chat.
Yes, I missed that. Let's see. So for those who fall under the hypomania bipolar side of the spectrum that would feel overstimulated by serotonin, what do you recommend? So, there's no easy answer, but I would say first and foremost, though that last group, like the lemon balm and the holy basil, are usually very well tolerated. So those ones I almost never, any herb could bother somebody, but like I almost never see problems, especially in that more like bipolar type. Also getting medications like just downright and all that might help as well. But I would say herb wise, I would be thinking about lemon balm. I might be thinking about possibly adaptogens as long as they're not too overstimulating. So ashwagandha is probably okay, but not always okay. For example, I believe there is a little bit of research showing it potentially beneficial, but like not everything works for everybody. And so I would say that those would be the main ones, and any of the other more nervine herbs that we didn't get into, but were mentioned briefly, you might want to look into some of those, like motherwort, for example. So there are lots of options in that group that I would feel more comfortable exploring. And it might also be a really great time to seek the guidance of a practitioner who has a specialty in mood and has experience with that, and or maybe also a therapist alongside. Usually the therapist can't advise on herbs even if they're trained in it based off of whatever their state licensure is, but you can often combine different folks in a team-based approach. But yeah, it is a little tricky. I would definitely be careful with all those first groups of herbs that we discussed, but the last group is usually pretty good. Let's see. Oh, good. I'm glad you like my science. I even brushed up on it a little bit. So I made quite a few updates actually from my 2019 version of this. Awesome. Oh, good. I'm glad you're enjoying my stuff. Let's see. Any questions? Any other questions that I'm missing? Awesome. Well, then I will let you all get on with your nights. Thank you so much. If you like free classes, you have to attend it live if you're not an HG member, but the American Herbalist Guild in 2 weeks is doing a free detox liver and lymph support class with me. And so that one will be coming up. It is recorded, but the recording is only available to AHG members. But the live class is free for everybody. And there's a free herb conference coming up very soon through the Herbal Academy that you'll be hearing a buzz about. And then my own series will be happening in spring through fall. So perhaps I will see you again. Regardless, have a wonderful night and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much, Maria. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.
Have a good night.
You too.